Welcome back to Midnight Fables. Tonight, we journey to the shadow of the Jagged Tooth Mountains. For centuries, the goblins lived as slaves in the dark, crushed under the iron heel of the orcs and their terrifying leader, Gorgon the Grim. But deep in the earth, a spark of rebellion is about to become an inferno. This is the story of Grolok, the peak of the small hand. In the bleak expanse where the jagged tooth mountains clawed at the sky and the sluggish, toxic currents of the sludge river flowed, life was a perpetual test of endurance. For centuries, the goblins, small, quick, and countless, dwelled in the damp, labyrinthine underworld, their very existence defined by the shadow of the orcs. The orcs, a race of towering muscle and dull intellect, were the undisputed masters of the surface world, their crude stone and timber fortress, Grimhold, sitting atop the only fertile ridge for miles. An average orc stood nearly 8 feet tall, his skin a mottled, sickly green, his muscles like knotted roots. Their minds were simple, obsessed only with conquest, brute strength, and consuming enormous quantities of poorly cooked meat. They possessed a staggering physical resilience, but lacked any imagination, foresight, or engineering skill. The goblins, by contrast, rarely exceeded 4 feet. Their strength lay in their sheer numbers, a vast, squirming population that had learned to survive where the orcs could not. They were natural tunnelers, expert scavengers, and possessed a wicked, if often misapplied, cunning. But for generations, their cunning had been stifled, their numbers exploited. They were nothing more than slaves, miners, bearers, and the preferred targets for orcish sport during their drunken revelries. At the apex of this cruelty stood Gorgon the Grim. He was not merely a chieftain, he was a monument to terror. Gorgon was larger and fiercer than any orc before him, said to have been sired by a mountain troll. His weapon, the massive, iron-headed warhammer he called Skull Splitter, was less a tool of war and more an extension of his own destructive will. The sight of Gorgon entering the goblin mines was enough to trigger instant paralysis, his booming voice echoing the promise of agonizing death. The orcs governed through terror and casual brutality. Tribute was demanded daily, ore from the mines, rare fungus from the deepest caves, and worst of all, young goblins to serve as menial laborers. It was this system, absolute and unchanging, that forged the spirit of Skitter. Skitter was an unremarkable goblin. He was shorter than many of his peers, with unusually large, observant yellow eyes. He had spent his early life hauling ore in the sweltering heat of the orcish mines. But while others accepted their fate, Skitter watched. He watched how the orcs drank themselves into stupors. He watched how their enormous weight made them careless on uneven terrain. He watched how their weapons, while heavy, were slow to recover. The moment that cemented Skitter's path came during the annual culling. An orc patrol, bored and drunk, had targeted Skitter's mate, Lyra. When Skitter found them, the orcs were gone, leaving only a bloodied, gruesome scene. Grief did not consume him, a cold, crystalline fury replaced it. He stopped mourning and started planning. His first task was to find allies. He sought out goblins who had suffered similar losses, those with keen eyes, quick hands, or a shred of formal literacy gleaned from scavenging discarded maps. His initial recruits were Zeet, a spindly goblin with an uncanny ability to hear conversations from incredible distances, Grok, a fierce female goblin who possessed the raw courage to lead ground troops, and Wiz, an aged, almost blind goblin sage who hoarded lost knowledge, specifically forgotten texts detailing early siege engines. Skitter established the Whispering Circle, meeting in the Fungus Pit, a vast cavern miles beneath Grimhold that orcs instinctively avoided. "We are 4,000 brothers and sisters," Skitter began his first mass address. "They are 600. If every one of us threw a single stone, they would be buried. Their strength is their armor. Our strength is our number and our mind." The rebellion began with silence. Zit and his runners identified the orcs' single main water source. Skitter's crew began mixing local, debilitating swamp fungus into the source. The orcs began suffering constant, agonizing stomach ailments, sapping their energy. Grok led teams specializing in minor sabotage. Support struts in the mines were weakened. Orcish weapon racks were tampered with, leaving blades dull and hammerheads loose. The orcs merely cursed their incompetent laborers, never realizing the systemic nature of the decay. The heart of Skitter's plan lay in the Forge of Freedom, a massive, abandoned lava tube. Here, under Wiz's technical guidance, the Goblins began their most ambitious undertaking, the construction of sophisticated weaponry. The primary weapon was the ballista, dubbed the spear hurler. It was constructed using highly elastic saplings and reinforced by salvaged iron bands. The bolts were custom forged, long, heavy projectiles tipped with razor-sharp slate. A goblin crew of 8 was needed to crank and load one machine, but it could launch a spear with enough force to penetrate orcish hide at 50 paces. They built 20 of these deadly devices. The secondary weapon was the catapult, the stone slinger. Their primary ammunition was not simple rock, but jagged shrapnel, a collection of mining debris and flaming pitch. The pitch was made from clay pots filled with thick, slow-burning material harvested from a petroleum seep. This required immense care, but its ability to spread fire and panic was priceless. They manufactured over 300 such pots. Every goblin not engaged in vital supply runs or intel gathering was tasked with construction. Tiny hands worked tirelessly, fueled by the dream of freedom. The rhythmic thunk-thunk-thunk of hammers was the new heartbeat of the goblin nation. After 2 long years of secret preparation, the day arrived. Skitter stood before his 3,982 available fighters, their eyes shining with a chilling, unified hunger. The time for the great reckoning had begun. The night chosen for the assault was the darkest of the season, a time when the new moon offered no light to the surface world. Rain slicked the forest, muffling the sound of thousands of tiny, determined feet. The assembly was a logistical masterpiece. Goblins, traditionally chaotic, moved with unprecedented discipline. They were divided into 40 companies of 100, each led by a lieutenant chosen by Grok. The spear hurlers and stone slingers were disassembled, their heavy components carried on the backs of the strongest goblins. This silent procession moved towards the ridge overlooking Grimhold. The orc fortress was a sprawling, ugly thing. Its palisade walls were built of massive tree trunks, 20 feet high. Inside the barracks, the stables, and Gorgon's central keep were arranged around a muddy central yard. 2 watchtowers were the only elevated defenses. Tonight, only one was manned. The other had mysteriously collapsed weeks prior due to weak wood. Zit, clinging like a moss patch to a wet rock, signaled the readiness of the orc guards. The transition had just occurred, meaning the current shift was tired and already partially drunk. Skitter gave the signal, a low, owl-like hoot. The construction team scrambled up the ridge, swiftly assembling the spear hurlers. Wiz supervised the critical tensioning of the torsion ropes. Every machine was aimed at a specific target, 1/3 at the main gates, 1/3 at the most crowded barrack, and the last third at the base of the main watchtower. The tension was suffocating. Thousands of goblins pressed themselves into the cold, wet earth. Skitter, standing beside Grok, gripped his salvaged axe. "Strike the tower first," he whispered to the operator of the nearest spear hurler. "Then the flames." A second hoot pierced the night. The orc sentry in the watchtower didn't hear the 20 massive thwacks of the torsion engines releasing. He only registered a sudden, agonizing pressure in his chest as the first 3 spear hurler bolts punched through the timber of the tower base. More spears followed, severing support beams. With a groan of splintering timber, the entire structure listed violently and then collapsed into the mud below, burying the sentry in a ruin of his own architecture. The orcs inside Grimhold were immediately alerted, but their initial reaction was confusion, not coordinated defense. Skitter gave the call. "Fire the pitch! Light the way to freedom!" The stone slingers sprang into action. 300 clay pots, trailing tails of dark smoke and incandescent flame, soared over the ramparts. They shattered on impact against the dry firewood, the main mess hall, and the thatched roofs of the sleeping barracks. Instantaneously, the night was ripped open by the orange glare of fire. The orcs, driven half-mad by their stomach sickness and now facing unexpected inferno, rushed from their barracks in a confused, panicking horde. They were not defenders, they were bullies, and panic eroded their already thin discipline. As the orcs stumbled out, the main spear hurlers pivoted. Their targets, the densest knots of armored orcs gathering near the gates. The heavy slate-tipped bolts struck with sickening force, piercing armor and smashing bone. Orcs went down in small clusters, their bulky frames proving to be excellent targets. the goblins began their advance. Skitter gave the final, high-pitched battle cry. Grok's vanguard, armed with long lances made from sharpened saplings, surged forward. The orcs at the wall finally managed to organize a defense, hurling stones and arrows over the burning palisade. The goblins suffered heavy casualties in the advance. Their small shields offered little protection. But for every goblin that fell, 3 more reached the base of the wall. The main objective was the east gate, the weakest structurally thanks to Zist's repeated sabotage. The stone slingers began concentrating their fire here, hammering the hinges and the crossbars. The sight of their fortifications being destroyed finally summoned the king of their fear. A roar, deeper and more terrifying than the crackle of the fire, ripped through the chaos. Gorgon the Grim had emerged. He stood in the center of the blazing yard, a monolith of green rage, silhouetted by the flames. His armor gleamed, and in his hands, Skull Splitter looked heavy enough to crush a tankard, let alone a skull. His eyes, burning red in the firelight, scanned the ridge, searching for the source of this calculated destruction. He saw the tiny green forms swarming the walls and let out a bellow that seemed to extinguish the courage in the hearts of dozens of goblins. Gorgon was not a strategist, but he was a survivor. He immediately identified the goblins' greatest strength, the siege engines, and their greatest weakness, themselves. Ignoring the burning buildings, he focused his entire terrible wrath on the main gate. He knew that if the goblins breached the wall, their numbers would overwhelm the diminished orc force. He stomped toward the east gate, scattering his own terrified troops. He was an unstoppable avalanche, his heavy frame shrugging off stray shrapnel. Skitter saw him coming. "He is heading for the gate! Focus fire! Slow him. Do not let him reach the gate." The 20 ballistas on the ridge shifted their targets, abandoning the barracks. A synchronized volley of 20 spear hurler bolts shot across the gap. The projectiles slammed into Gorgon's reinforced leather armor. Some glanced off his massive shoulder plates, but 3 found soft spots: his upper thigh, the side of his knee, and a lucky, shallow hit just beneath his rib cage. Gorgon roared, a primal sound of shock and blinding pain. He was wounded, bleeding a thick, dark ichor, but he did not fall. He merely glared at the ridge, an expression of utter hatred twisting his face. He pulled 1 bolt out of his leg and snapped it over his knee. The delay, however, was crucial. At the east gate, the combined effort of the stone slingers and the goblin sappers had worked. With a splintering, wet crack, the timber finally gave way, collapsing inward. "Breach! Breach! Follow Grok!" Skitter screamed. The vanguard, led by Grok, a whirlwind of small, sharp fury, poured through the gap. They were met instantly by a disorganized line of orcs who had been trying to shore up the gate. The fight was immediate and brutal. The orcs, relying on heavy swings, found themselves facing a swarm. Goblins used the orcs' height against them, ducking beneath heavy axes and stabbing upwards with their lances, aiming for armpits, throats, and the groin. Grok herself vaulted onto the back of a large orc lieutenant, driving her salvaged pickaxe into his neck. Her company followed her example, ignoring the traditional fear of engaging in close combat. They were taught to operate like fire ants, overwhelming one brute through disciplined, continuous attack. Gorgon, his attention split between the siege engines and the sudden breach, made a terrible choice. He couldn't leave his remaining troops to be slaughtered. He turned his attention from the machines and lumbered toward the breach. Skull Splitter held high. This was the deadliest part of the battle. Gorgon met the flowing tide of goblins at the broken gate. For the next 10 minutes, he was unstoppable. He didn't swing his hammer so much as he simply swept it, creating a bloody wake in the surging green tide. Goblins were pulped, tossed aside, or cleaved in two. He cleared the breach repeatedly, standing over the wreckage like a nightmare. Skitter knew this was the crisis point. If Gorgon closed the gate, the war was over. He ran forward. "Climbing teams! Focus on the walls! Bypass the monster!" 100 goblins used spiked ropes to scramble up the inside of the walls. Reaching the top, they showered the orcs below with shrapnel. This distraction bought the goblins at the gate precious seconds. The final act of the battle was focused entirely on the confrontation between the leader of the oppressed and the symbol of their oppression. Gorgon was now cornered near his central keep, surrounded by a ring of terrified but determined goblins. He had single-handedly killed nearly 400 of Skitter's troops, but the price was grievous. He was bleeding from multiple deep punctures, his armor was dented, and his breathing was ragged. Skullsplitter dragged slightly in the mud. Skitter called out, his voice hoarse. "He is wounded. Do not engage him. Keep the distance. Pin him down." Grok arrived with the last of the elite shock troops. They had brought the nets, thick, heavy hunting nets woven from iron wire. Gorgon, seeing the new arrivals, let out a final, terrifying roar and charged. The goblins scattered before him, but as he ran, Grok and her team moved with trained precision. 2 nets were thrown high, collapsing over his massive head and torso, momentarily blinding him. He roared and thrashed, tearing the heavy wire with his powerful hands, but the delay was enough. More nets followed, trapping his legs, forcing him to stumble into the thick mud. Skitter saw the opening he had been planning for. He raised his hand and waved. From the 2 remaining spear hurlers that had survived the counterfire, 2 special bolts were loaded. These were not the usual slate-tipped spears, but short, heavy iron spikes loaded with maximum torsion. They were meant to pierce metal, not just flesh. The ballistas fired simultaneously. The first iron spike slammed into the exposed joint of Gorgon's left elbow, snapping the bone with a gruesome crack. The second spike struck him squarely in the thick, unprotected thigh, plunging deep and anchoring him to the spot. Gorgon's bellow turned into a choked, gurgling scream of unimaginable pain. He dropped Skullsplitter. The goblins rushed in, a green tsunami of blades and anger. They did not show mercy. They attacked the downed giant with every weapon they had. They were fighting not just for victory, but for 2 centuries of fear and servitude. Skitter climbed onto the back of his defeated enemy, his small, muddy boots resting on Gorgon's broad shoulder. He raised the stolen Orcish axe high. With a final furious cry, he brought the axe down, ending the reign of Gorgon the Grim forever. As the great orc chieftain fell silent, a wave of realization washed over the remaining orcs. Their leader was dead. Their arrogance evaporated instantly, replaced by sheer panic. The remaining orcs threw down their weapons, some attempting to flee, only to be chased down by the faster goblin patrols. Dawn broke over Grimhold. The orc fortress was a smoking, ruined pyre. The goblins had paid a steep price, but they had won the impossible war. The war was over, and the goblins had finally come home. The smoke from Grimhold was still thick and acrid as the sun rose fully over the jagged Tooth Mountains. The victory was absolute, but the cost was etched into the muddy, blood-soaked ground of the former orc encampment. Roughly 1,000 goblins had perished in the coordinated assault, a devastating loss for their small race, yet a necessary sacrifice for the survival of the remaining 3,000. Skitter, his small body aching from exertion, fatigue, and the sheer emotional weight of the night, surveyed the scene. Gorgon's corpse, half buried in the mud near the keep, was already being stripped of his formidable armor by goblin scavengers, not out of disrespect, but out of necessity. Skullsplitter, the massive warhammer, had been hauled away by a team of 50 goblins struggling to lift its enormous weight. It would be enshrined, Skitter decided, not as a weapon, but as a monument to the tyranny they had overcome. The surviving orcs, perhaps 200 exhausted, terrified, and wounded brutes, were herded into the few remaining sturdy storage pens. Their morale was shattered. Without Gorgon's terrible presence, they were nothing more than big, confused animals. The goblins now faced their first major challenge of sovereignty: what to do with their defeated masters. Skitter gathered the surviving leaders in the center of the muddy yard, around a sputtering fire. Grok, her scarred face smeared with blood and grime, stood tall, her presence radiating a new, hard-won authority. Zit, though still jumpy, was already organizing patrols and mapping the damage. Wiz, exhausted but triumphant, was supervising the dismantling of the siege engines, salvaging the precious metal bands and torsion ropes. "We have won the light," Skitter said, his voice raw. "Now we must learn to live in it." The immediate priorities were clear and urgent. First, the wounded. Skitter ordered that the orc barracks, now partially burned but structurally sound, be cleared of debris and turned into makeshift infirmaries. Goblins, who had once been forced to mine for the orcs, now used their knowledge of herbs and salves to tend to their own injured kin. Second, defense. The orcs who were now prisoners posed a threat, but the forest held other dangers: trolls, ogres, and opportunistic bands of human mercenaries who occasionally wandered through the passes. The fortress walls were compromised, especially at the east gate. Skitter deployed teams of goblins to fortify the existing defenses, reinforcing the breaches with quick-drying clay and sharpened log spikes. Their ingenious spear hurlers were now repositioned on the ramparts, aimed outwards, turning Grimhold into a true, defensible fortress for the first time. The question of the orc prisoners dominated the early council. Grok was for extermination. They showed us no mercy, Skitter. To let them live is to invite future wars. They will breed, they will remember, and they will return to their tyranny. Wiz, the sage, offered a more pragmatic view. Slaughter creates martyrs, and we are tired. We are too few to fight another battle. But their strength is useful. We make them serve. They will rebuild what they destroyed. They will work the mines for their survival. Skitter considered this. The cycle of violence must end, but the debt of labor must be paid. The orcs will work. Their existence will be our stability. But we will not be their orcs. No casual torture. No sport. We will rule with discipline, not malice. If they attempt rebellion, then we enforce our justice swiftly. The decree was passed. The orc prisoners were put to work, forced to wear heavy, simple chain links, and overseen by goblin guards armed with ballista bolts as spears. Within a month, the name Grimhold was officially abolished. The goblins rechristened their new home Grolok, the peak of the small hand. The goblin society began to reorganize. Skitter established a system of meritocracy. Grok became the war master, responsible for defense. She instituted a rigorous training regime, teaching every goblin to be proficient with the new, manageable crossbows they began manufacturing. Zeet was named the master of tunnels and trade, overseeing communications and the newly opened diplomatic channels. Wiz became the chief engineer, establishing workshops for better weapons and tools for farming. The goblins discovered that the fertile ridge could yield excellent harvests of root vegetables. They dug irrigation canals and engineered efficient ventilation systems for their mines. Their true power, however, remained their technology. Grolok became known for its defenses. Any approaching enemy would be met with a rain of high-velocity spears and flaming pitch. Skitter often walked the ramparts, a small figure in a leadership position once reserved for a giant. One evening, he stood at the former east gate and looked at the mountain pass. The peace was fragile. News of the orcs' defeat was beginning to spread. No one yet believed the truth, that 4,000 tiny goblins had utterly defeated 600 colossal orcs. Skitter understood that this disbelief was their second greatest asset. "Zit," Skitter called out. "Have the runners returned?" "Yes, Master Skitter." They saw a band of 25 human outriders. They scouted the ridge, but saw only the reinforced walls and the smoke from the forges. They moved on quickly. "Good. They saw strength. Keep the fires burning, Zit, and remind Wiz to prioritize the secondary tunnel network. If war comes again, Grolok must not be our only defense. We must always have the earth on our side." "Yes, Master Skitter. For the free goblins," Zit whispered. Skitter looked at the sky, seeing opportunity in the twilight. They were the architects of their own destiny, small in size, but enormous in their ingenuity. Their war against the orcs had established their freedom, but the next war, to maintain it against a greedy world, was just beginning. The legend of Skitter and the free goblins of Grolok is just one of many tales from the edges of the map. If you enjoyed this journey into the Jagged Tooth Mountains, be sure to like this fable and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting in the shadows, and the next one is just a heartbeat away. Until then, keep your fires burning. This has been Midnight Fables.